Hello and welcome to this series of public policy discussions. I'm joined by Raj Srivastava, incoming Dean of the Indian School of Business. Raj, thank you very much for being with us. So I'm going to ask you, as you come in, and you come in from a different vantage point because you've been overseas all these years teaching and leading different universities. What are the three challenges that you see to economic growth and prosperity in India?
Okay. When we're looking at economic growth, I mean, obviously the opportunities are great in India. It's got a huge market, and this is what many of the foreign companies are looking for. If you look at Chinese companies like Xiaomi, or you look at Lenovo, so what's the attraction of India? It's the market. That should obviously be of value to Indian companies as well. And so what are some of the challenges? The challenges are really that we need to accelerate our manufacturing, for one thing. I think we're doing very well in the services area, but we need to, let's say, look at the manufacturing sector and see what's holding it back. And we need to look at in my opinion, we need to look at the entire ecosystem. So, if I'm a manufacturing unit, I'm part of a value chain, I'm part of a supply chain, and my success depends on what's happening in the rest of the supply chain. Several problems out here. One is human capital. And so by human capital, what I mean is, people who are trained. In many of the industries I've talked to, especially the larger companies, are concerned about turnover, because the smaller companies are using them as the training ground. So when I talk to the West, and let's say if I'm talking to CEOs out there and ask them what is their top priority, they're going to tell me something strategic. What I hear in India is human capital. That the biggest challenge is human capital. Another thing that I keep hearing is that we need more people who think strategically and not technically. And being an engineer, I thought maybe when they said technically, they meant, people who...
Engineering skills.
People who speak engineering. And it turned out, no, they really meant not just the engineers, but, people in accounting and finance who were very well trained with tools, but were not very in tune with looking at how do you manage strategic relationships with clients and so on. So human capital is one. In manufacturing, a big problem is investment. I've run into several CEOs of companies that are doing 30-40 million US, and these are mid-sized enterprises. And I'm told, Raj, we could grow at 50%, we could grow at 60%, but we just don't have the working capital. All right, the working capital to SMEs is very expensive in India, and what that does is it really ties one pack behind their back, because by the time they have paid for money to operate, the entire margin may have gone, and it's actually a tribute to Indian SMEs that they can survive in this kind of an environment, that they are creative enough, that they're able to do it.
Right. So some of these issues, let's say if it's to do with capital or investment, could be cyclically solved. I mean, they haven't been solved so far, but let's say for some reason we were to see the gates of capital opening up, and then potentially we could see more capital. But human capital is a far more critical issue, I would assume. What's the kind of intervention that we ought to be looking at there?
So, it's obviously going to depend on the industry. So, whether if it's manufacturing, it's going to be, we need to look at the ecosystem there. If it is healthcare, we need to look at the ecosystem in healthcare. So, it's in healthcare, it would have to include nursing. It would have to include lab technicians. It would have to, include, all the people who are involved in healthcare delivery. And even there, it's we have a diverse delivery system. It's So if you're talking about hospitals, it's one thing. If you're talking about clinics, it's another thing. If you're talking about public health and preventive care, it's another thing. But let's say we take hospitals where India is actually doing quite well. And so it may be that you have the Mayo Clinics of the world that develop the new therapies, let's say through research. It doesn't mean that we can't do it here. But in many ways, what we face in India in healthcare may be similar to what we may face in, let's say, manufacturing of, new generation of automobiles. Do we need to spend our money in product development, in the context of healthcare research, or is there enough knowledge available that we can use and use process knowledge to do things better? And I think India has been quietly doing quite well in process knowledge. Okay, we learn how to do things efficiently and effectively because we are resource constraints. And in that kind of environment, we are able to do simple things like cataract operations, but fairly complicated things such as bypass and angioplasty and so on. And we've learned to do that very, very well, very, very efficiently. And so we sometimes make the mistake of thinking that all innovation is something new. I prefer to define innovation as doing some things better. And so whether it is healthcare or it is the automotive sector, what we need to do, excuse me, what we need to do in India is to do things that are relevant for the Indian environment. So maybe 5 years from now, we will be doing cutting edge research in an area. And it's not that we shouldn't do it right now. If it gives us a competitive advantage, why not? And our competitive advantage is human capital. So even when it comes to doing research, we can tap our human capital, people who have PhDs in chemistry and biology. That does give us a competitive advantage. But I think if you're looking at where the benefits are more immediate, I think let's use knowledge that's already there. Let's not worry about reinventing, but let's learn how to do things better. And
so you're saying exploit human capital much better, squeeze it out in a way because it's already there to some extent. But you also pointed to the gap. The CEOs that you met who talked about that they have a lot of things, but they don't have enough human capital for real serious growth.
And human capital that is willing and capable of taking on big projects. So one thing I sometimes hear is, how can we get our people to think big enough? Okay, so instead of worrying about, can I be the top 3 in India, how do we get to the top of the world?
And how do we address that? I mean, I know it's a very, very, very broad brush ask, but how do we address these through academic interventions or public policy interventions? How do you make people more capable, more skilled, the ability to think bigger?
The government can play a role, but it is not something that the government can do alone. The government can provide incentive systems. So let me just tell you 2 stories. One is I came to Singapore on July 1, 2008. In August, we had the stock market crash globally. And so India was hit, Singapore was hit, everybody was hit. And by September, I had some people from the Ministry of Education in Singapore come to me, because I was responsible for programs, and say, look, we know that people who lost job in manufacturing are not going to get those jobs back. Those jobs have gone to Malaysia, they've gone to China, and that's the end of story. We got to do something with these people. So can SMU develop programs for the financial sector and healthcare? And if you develop these programs, we will pick up 70-80% of the cost. So they still wanted people who needed to be retrained to put in some skin in the game, not totally free. But if SMU would develop these programs, they said, we will cover 80% of the cost of tuition. Then they turned to banks and they turned to hospitals and said, if you take these people as interns, as trainees, we will pick up the first $2,000 per month in salary. So the difference was that the education sector, the government regulations providing the incentives, and the incentives to to the corporate sector was that the government would pick up the cost. And so it is spending money a little bit more effectively than simply giving unemployment, which is what I would have been used to coming from the US. So I learned a lot. So this is one story. The second story is I've been working off and on with the former President Nathan in Singapore. And when I first met him, I was asking him about how did Singapore emerge, because if I look at pictures of Singapore from '65, they're no different from rundown areas in Calcutta. Really no different in those pictures. So I asked him, how did this change take place? And how did you get foreign companies to invest? So a big issue at that time was that there was labor unrest in Singapore. Foreign companies didn't want to invest.
Similar to Calcutta.
Yeah, no difference. He said, so what we had to do, and he was from the labor side, is that we had to tell people who had a job to calm down because there were other Singaporeans who didn't even have a job. And the idea was, if you will calm down, we will negotiate on your behalf. Then they could turn to the multinationals and say, we will give you a strike-free environment, but we need you to invest in human capital. So he said that one of the first companies to come into Singapore under this umbrella was Texas Instruments. I want to complete the story here. I was talking to Professor Pankaj Chandra, who was the director at IIM Bangalore, because SMU had built a relationship with IIM Bangalore. So I asked him the same story. I said, what do you think led to the emergence of Bangalore? So he walked me over to a wall and he said this. He pointed to a picture. It was the first Earth to satellite microwave system. And so I said, who set that up? Texas Instruments. So there's a common thread, if you will, in these two vignettes, that we really should be open to other people, whether it's from, in this case it will happen to be the same company. But Singapore has been like a giant trade-free zone. Human capital and financial capital has been able to move in and out. So Singapore did not have the IITs. They did not have the IIMs. But you go to Singapore and you'll find over 1,000 IIT alums and over 1,000 IIM alums. So they have created an environment where human capital is attracted to. And they have used that human capital along with the financial capital as a ladder for growth. So when we look at India, we have to provide an environment where we are able to reduce the uncertainties. And yes, we need to have our regulations. We don't need to mimic everything that the US has done or Singapore has done or somebody else has done. We need to accommodate our own challenges, but we need things that are stable. So if I'm coming in from outside, if I'm making a direct investment in India, I need to have some security about the rules that we're playing under. And by the way, it's not just India, because we see the same problems in China. In China, they keep moving the goalposts, which is making China a little bit more uncertain. Right. But uncertainty is not a good thing.